Rob Butler is professor of anthropology at Boston University. He's author of a number of books, just to name a few: Unities and Diversities in China's Religion, Resistance, Chaos, and Control in China, Taiwan Travels, Taiwan's Ghosts, published by the press as well, and Discovering Nature, Globalization, and Environmental Culture in China, Taiwan, Cambridge Press. David Jordan is professor emeritus of anthropology at UC San Diego, working on cultural and psychological anthropology, social linguistics,
past tense.
works, cross-cultural study of religion. So just a number of the books that he's authored: Gods, Ghosts, and Ancestors, The Folk Religion in Taiwan's Village, University of California Press, Flying Phoenix, Aspects of Sectarianism in Taiwan, co-authored with David Rivermeyer, Princeton University Press. So let's welcome Rob and David for our panel on.
I think the charter that was in here for what we should talk about was that we should talk about how our work influences or has implications for later research. I'm not sure my work has any relations for later research, so I'll have to kind of wing it, see what emerges. I first went to Taiwan in 1966. I had been a graduate student at the University of Chicago. Chicago at that time did not teach Chinese, modern spoken Chinese. It gave its first course in modern Chinese, and I think 65 maybe or 64, and taught by a complete idiot. And I remember his opening lines were, "I don't know the tones and I see no reason why you should." The view was that nobody on the planet actually spoke Chinese. It was available only as a written language. There was no reason to learn anything else. So this was not a good place to learn Chinese. I had a government fellowship that was covering graduate studies. So I went to Stanford, where I had an MA in anthropology from a program that I did not like, which is why I went to Chicago. So I was back at Stanford, and that was the summer of 65. Took first year Chinese, came back to Chicago, encountered this idiot. There was no way to follow up on it. Went back to Stanford for another summer of Chinese, and then headed off for field work. The result was I arrived in Taiwan with 2 summer courses in Chinese. It turns out most people in Taiwan speak Chinese at a higher level than second year summer course. And I can remember arriving in Taipei and staying at the Zhongguo, which you may remember is right on the main square. And going down, it was right near the bookstores. And it was fascinating. I would look at things and all right, and I have to be able to get back here. Let's see, this is the street that is Zhong, character I don't know, something blue. And it was a little bit like going to mass years later in a Chinese church, and it was Christmas time. A whole group of American friends went together, and we would sing out loud and clear in the hymns on the characters we knew and shut up on the characters we didn't. And every now and then you'd go a little bit wrong. The result was I ended up in southern Taiwan linguistically seriously disadvantaged. I spent a lot of time in the village sort of looking and watching and so on, but and I never did develop terribly good Mandarin. And Mandarin subverts your study of Taiwanese, if you know it, because so many people speak Mandarin, know Mandarin, and you have much better teaching materials in Mandarin, and dictionaries are in Mandarin. So everything is stacked in favor of Mandarin, and that subverts your learning of something else. The same thing happens in lots of other countries. People who go to Indonesia end up learning Bahasa a little bit in the United States or from Duolingo these days or whatever, and then it turns out they never learn Balinese, which is harder than Bahasa, and it's an obstacle. If you arrive in Papua New Guinea and you already spoke Tok Pisin, you're going to end up doing your field work in Tok Pisin because that's what it is, and you're just never going to learn the indigenous language. That was my situation. I compensated for this by trying to take the most elaborate notes, checking everything in every dictionary I could get. I spent an enormous amount of time sort of trying to offset this deficiency. For the most part, that was successful, but it was very time consuming, and it was a challenge. I was in a very In the 60s, I was in a little village that I called Bao'an eventually. The government called it Yongle at the time. It had been called Bao'anliao in Japanese times, I think. Yongle, eternal happiness, Bao'an, sort of protecting peace. Bao'an was the name that I adopted because it would be the same in pinyin as it would be relatively pronounceable, and it was the name of lots of temples around the area. So it was a very localized kind of name. It was not bad, and it was pronounceable in English as long as you put a hyphen in. So it was it was in an area near Shigang, which has a huge jiao, which was a fascinating and utterly unintelligible event. Rick Schipper was a Dutch, Paris-educated scholar who was working in Tainan near there and had made himself a Daoist priest of low rank, but it put him in position to understand Daoist rituals. He was very helpful in understanding the jiao and what was going on with the jiao. But in the course of things, in my little village, people occasionally went into trance. And this was fascinating. I conceived of part of my mission as being understanding and describing for an Anglophone audience things that were idiosyncratic from an English speaker's perspective, things that we didn't understand, things that we didn't have. It was not particularly interesting for me to say, oh, all right, these people raise rice. We know about rice. We don't necessarily know about Chinese trance. And so I was, among the other things that I was thrashing around trying to find out, I was fascinated by these spirit mediums, and I'd been told they existed. I didn't know that I would eventually find 9 of them, each with a somewhat different story, a different event, a different everything. In one case, little kids came banging on the door in the morning. "Hey, you got to go see, there's a spirit medium went into trance last night." It was a guy who came home and suddenly went into trance for the first time in his life. It became the case study for a textbook in anthropology that my colleague Mark Swartz and I published. Eventually, I extracted that case study and stuck it on my website so that I could use it in classes. It may be the first ethnographic study ever of a spirit medium's very first trance. That's possible. What happens? I mean, how does this work? What are these mediums? What are they all about? Well, it turns out there's more mediums than I ever met, because there were also the sort of kanbong who were called for communicating with the dead. And there were some mediums who were so private, they dealt only with women's affairs in women's front parlors. I never met these people. So there are more. And the ones I interviewed and talked to were not very informative. They would go into trance, but then they wouldn't know what they would done in trance. It was a little bit like people who are hypnotized. And they occupied all kinds of positions, but they made decisions. And the decisions had, I can only call local level political influence on things. An example would be, First and 15th people would put out all kinds of they put out their dinner in baskets in front of the little temple in the town. And the question was, when are the gods finished with this stuff? Well, you could throw buey, but who's going to throw the, well, the mayor could throw the buey maybe, or somebody in trance could could reveal it. Usually the mayor would do it, but somebody in trance could do it. If you had a difficult decision that required more than just simple buey, or more than simple buey plus the little Chen's poems in the temple, somebody in trance would do it. That was one piece. There was an old man in the village who was the senior most of these spirit mediums. I used to call them shamans, and I gave a talk at Northwestern when I came back and encountered somebody who insisted you may not ever, ever, ever use the word shaman unless you're talking about Siberia. You're a very bad person for using the word that way. All right, I've learned to say spirit mediums because people like that shut up. So the shamans, some of them would heal a little bit, but mostly they were messengers, and mostly they were conversational messengers. Now, how do you know that the trance is real? When you're an old spirit medium and you've been in the business for a long time, nobody doubts you. You're in the village. Everybody knows who you are. You've done it before. They've seen the whole. You don't have to prove it. If you're the new spirit medium that I said to go into trance, he required initiation. So my little chapter for the textbook involved his initiation as well. What's his initiation? Well, among other things, you throw boiling oil on yourself and things. It's fairly severe. It's not something you do frivolously just because you thought it was fun. One spirit medium had been very successful. He'd moved into Tainan City, and he had thrown himself into the spirit medium business. There was already a very successful spirit medium in Tainan City who'd gone as a child, who'd gone into trance first as a child, called the Ginasian, the child medium, the child immortal rather, and was running a profitable business of clients. Spirit mediums typically don't charge money, but they always get contributed money and they don't turn it down. So they're a little bit like matchmakers that way. And so our Baoan boy had gone into the city. He was in competition with this guy, but he set up a temple outside. There was land outside the city, to a little bit to the north of Tainan, or to the east of Tainan. And he was so successful that when I visited him a little later, he had a gigantic temple, just huge, this vast mountain, this great pyramid of a building with all kinds of subordinate things and chi shui stands and the whole works. 8 years later, it was gone. I don't know what the story was. I have no idea. I had I had hired a girl from an adjacent village who came in and did transcriptions of some interviews, and she did a little bit of interviewing as well. And she had an aunt who was a patron of a temple in Mado that had been was being used by a spirit writing group. And I'd never seen spirit writing. I didn't know anything about spirit writing. So, all right, I'll go off to her aunt's temple and find out about spirit writing. And the honorable foreigner comes in and is given his honorable oranges and set in the honorable corner and told to shut honorably up and watch the proceedings. And here was somebody. These people were writing text, and the text would be written. There'd be somebody who's writing, somebody sitting beside who reads out what the thing is, and it's gu, and it's go, and then it's zok. Sometimes there's a group of people, and everybody will say gu, and everybody will say, and everybody will say zok, except the one guy who said su, and then looks embarrassed, and because it's writing on a sand thing, it's not very clear. And they were putting these out, and they were distributing them, and there were lots of people sitting around at night. It was associated with lots more activity, but I was going to go home, so I couldn't follow it up. I did later field work that focused very much on this. When I talked to people in the village about it, this was all part of the mysterious Iguan Dao, the duck egg religion. And everybody knew that they were very, very bad and very mysterious. And furthermore, they probably took all their clothes off at night when they went for rituals, and it was very. So I needed to know more about, but I used a little bit of the time at the end to try to visit some more of these spirit writing groups, which were collectively called Bailuan, worshiping the phoenix, except that Luan can also be the bell under a imperial chariot, apparently. So there's different constructions of it. I visited several of these groups. They were clearly dealing with trance. We're dealing with people writing in trance. We're dealing with people speaking in trance. When you're speaking in trance, but not when you're writing in trance as a spirit medium, your initiation and subsequently your constant demonstration that you are legitimate involves mortification of the flesh. So we find temples in which there are sawfish saws and occasionally an axe, almost always some swords. A ball of nails is very common. These guys all came up at the Shigang Jiao. And in the great procession, the 3-day procession at the Shigang, here would be these spirit mediums. And furthermore, villages would compete as to how many spirit mediums they had. So when we got a new spirit medium that came into trance in Baoan, everybody was really happy because we would have one more. and we could one up those other bastards from the next village over at the Great Jiao Festival. So the Jiao Festival comes up. There are these palanquins. There are spirit mediums, and they're usually riding on the back of the palanquin with the god statues in it. When they get to other villages, they suddenly go into their act, and they sort of, mortify the flesh and so forth. This was fascinating. It's not possible to follow the procession from the Great Jiao at Qigong because no two pieces of it are in the same line at the same time. It's one procession. Everything has a number. Everything is supposed to arrive at the temple and leave the temple in order of its number. But once you're out, we're going to that village, and then they're going to this village, and he's going to that village. So one ethnographer has no hope in the world of following because there's too many of these, and they're going all over the place. And this one has this circuit, and we don't go there because we don't like those people, but we go to this because these people are allied with us. And in this one, we're a little tiny villagelet, so we have a joint palanquin for both of us, every possible arrangement, but always with spirit mediums, always mortifying the flesh, not doing the revelation thing at all, but the same people that are doing the revelation thing. This is their manifestation as I'd have to say miracle because they don't feel any pain. All of these are sort of trance behaviors. There's another trance behavior that turns up in things like this, and that is professional elements. I didn't know what to call them at the time. They're called junto today, and I don't know whether they've always been called junto, dintao. But they usually are composed of several marchers and some kind of a center. So the center, the commonest one is soldiers in the employ of whatever god is involved, with some kind of leaders who do martial arts routines. And when you get to a friendly village where you're going, you do martial arts routines, and that's fine. However, there was one set that was a little different. They were heavily painted. They had heavily face painted like Chinese opera paintings. Turns out no two groups were painted the same way because the actual paintings are secret. Well, they can't be secret because you see them all. You can photograph them, yeah, but they're supposed to be, you're not supposed to know. You don't know how to do it. And they stay in trance. So it's hot, they're sweating, everybody's going on the procession. You get to the temple, you've done your little routine, you stand there. They're still in trance. They're not supposed to eat or drink anything, and because otherwise they would have to urinate, and they're in trance. How much in trance are they? Well, when they get in front of a temple, they go into their routine, and it's a very patterned routine. It's a martial arts routine. It's beautifully done. They're doing it perfectly. But sometimes somebody gets a little out of order and jumps around a little more than he should, in which case the exorcist who's ever with them comes and blows a bunch of rice wine in his face to calm him down. And he gets calmed down, and then he can behave. How deep is this trance? What is this trance? What did they tell you about the trance? So we have three kinds of trance now. We have the kind that's the dancing trance. We have the kind that's the spirit writing trance. Actually, four kinds. We have the self-mutilization trance, and we have the spoken oracle trance. When I went back the next time, I was staying in a Buddhist monastery, which was a picturesque place to stay. It gave me a whole new view of what garden terraces are for. But I was in the city because there were a number of these spirit writing associations in the city. Turns out many of them are freestanding, particularly in the countryside, they'll be freestanding. Someone will say, I've heard there's such a thing as spirit writing, let's try it. And it turns out to be a very old tradition that goes back and back and back. I suspect it goes back to the time of Confucius and before, but who knows? Automatic writing is still alive and well, and they produce rather anodyne morality texts if they're ambitious. If they're not very ambitious, it's much less elaborate than that. So I went to many groups as I was leaving the first time. When I went back the second time, I was determined to find some stable groups that I could sort of visit several times. I came upon the Tsuwei Tang, which is a island-wide confederation of spirit writing groups, and they do a combination of chanting society, chanting groups, and spirit writing sessions. And they produced these texts. The one I had first come upon was actually produced a whole book that they published, and they gave it to me, and I couldn't read it. My language abilities were not up to it. Here, how many places does an anthropologist go? And these informants say, okay, here is our view of the world, and we bound it all up, we printed it up, we bound it, and here's a copy of it. You have it right here. And I mean, they're giving it to me, and I can't make sense of it. Get back to that in a second. The other group, the problem was this duck egg thing. And ordinary people, including the guys who were the monastics in my monastery who knew that I was studying heterodox stuff, said, well, that's all duck egg religion. That's all the Iguan Dao. So the Iguan Dao does exist. It's the pattern for the Tzu Tang, which is very, very similar. And the Iguan Dao was founded on the mainland in the early 20th century. It was specifically outlawed in 1948 when after the Second World War, lots of secret societies on the mainland were outlawed. And it figures a little bit in Li Shi's 1948 book on secret societies of North China. So we know a little bit about it. It was illegal in Taiwan, and it was operating very openly. They had, there was a person who was an Iguan Dao convert who had an old friend who had founded a temple that was the Confucianism Taoism study temple, and it was a shangtang was the term that he used, the holy hall. And this young Iguan Dao person was very nice to the old man. The old man died and left him the temple, and now he had a temple. So now we had an Iguan Dao temple in town. He was a very ambitious person. He eventually built another beautiful temple in Kaohsiung. There were 3 temples in the whole group. This is an illegal sect. This is a sect which the government objects to. And I couldn't figure out why would the government object? What are they doing? Well, they're sitting there and they're meditating. Right, good, very bad. Why? What, did they levitated the Pentagon or something? What is it that is so bad about meditating? It's the same problem you have with the Falun Dafa. So I couldn't figure it out. So I figured I would go to the Ministry of the Interior and find out what is the objection. And the answer was, go away, we don't talk to foreigners. So I went to the Kuomintang office, and a very nice man with the Kuomintang told me that, well, we don't really care. They're not doing anything. It's just the law. And we're just, I mean, who cares? We got much bigger fish to fry than this. Why don't you go eat some oranges and have some tea? It'll be fine. And so the Kuomintang was much more helpful than the ministry was. But so I eventually joined the Iguan Dao and was duly initiated because the initiation was secret. How was I going to find out if I didn't get initiated? But I continued to go to the Tzu Tang and things. What was clear to me was that the people who were attracted to this seemed to be people that were not enmeshed in villages. They were in small towns. Oftentimes, they seemed to be immigrants. These groups had far more mainland participants than would have been expected in that area. And I took them as sort of the family of people that have moved away from their families. And I think that's probably not wrong. But it was another issue where trance comes into the whole thing. All right, moving forward, I'd just gone home when this entrepreneur of the Iguan Dao was arrested and had to make public confessions, and the whole thing was dismantled. And then the Iguan Dao people came to visit me in La Jolla, and I gave them oranges and tea, and it was all fine. Going back many years later, it turns out various things. There had been a restudy. Beg your pardon?
Ding Renjie.
Yes, right. Ding Zhanjian. And Ding Zhanjie had translated my book. He had done a restudy of the same village. And I remember him telling me, I don't know how you found all these spirit mediums. I can't find any. They're just gone. Oh, that's interesting. Does it take a foreigner to pull them out of the woods, or is it? And I realized I was seeing it at one moment. maybe I was seeing it at a moment when there were lots of spirit mediums for some obscure reason, and suddenly they were gone again. After all, I was seeing it at a moment when cilantro was fashionable before people knew about garlic. And cilantro is no longer fashionable, thank God, but garlic is very much in. So these things do change, and one thinks one's seeing something that's kind of timeless. And lots of things are not, in fact, timeless. They're subject to fashion. Then I see more of these beautiful processional groups. And I knew that Tainan was very good at this. Jiayi was not quite as good, but that was partly because they were in Jiayi and they weren't as good as Tainan anyway. It turns out that there was a kind of sloppiness coming in. People would go into trance and nobody would come and kick them back into proper form anymore. It offended my aesthetic sensibilities, I'll admit. The thing was changing. It was shifting. The people who were going into trance were not rehearsing. Now, there's been an increase in the availability of factory jobs and things. So the other thing that was happening was people were not putting a rehearsal time into these processional elements that they had been. People were working in factories. They were not just farmers. These things are designed to fit in an agricultural cycle when you have an off season when you can actually rehearse. You couldn't rehearse. So the whole processional system was changing in response to the labor available. The children are in schools more than they were. Things are, the whole business was evolving before my eyes. Maybe that had something to do, the spirit possession part of it. Meanwhile, a student of mine had stumbled, and he was working in Taipei in the 70s, I guess, Mark Moskowitz, and he discovered kind of ghosts that we'd never encountered. The ghosts of aborted fetuses. And it turns out if you abort a fetus, the fetus is pissed as hell and may come back and do damage, but the fetus will be reincarnated in a couple of years. So there are temples that take care of managing the fetus. There are exorcists who specialize in getting. So we have another new thing coming in. And again, I'd never heard of a ghost of an aborted fetus when I was in the village. There were people had abortions, but they didn't produce ghosts. So we looked back to try and find if we could find earlier aborted fetus ghosts. Well, you can find infanticide ghosts. There's traces of those, but not abortion ghosts earlier on. Marco wrote a whole book about it. That's his thunder to talk about. But so I guess my what I learned in all this is the whole thing is a very, very volatile thing. And even something that seems so traditional as spirit writing and whatnot is going to turn out to be constantly evolving. When I got back from my bout in the monastery, I got a telephone call from Dan Overmeyer, who said he'd been looking at the texts that had been produced this way from the Ming times forward, but he had no ethnographic background for describing it. And I had been looking at the ethnography and couldn't make much sense of the texts. That was how we came to collaborate in the Flying Phoenix. And we found that our interests were so different that the way to write the book was to write 2 introductions and then interleave our chapters. So there'd be, all right, here's the Zihui Tang as seen ethnographically. Here it is as seen through its texts. And each of us it was a very good collaboration because he was in Vancouver and I was in San Diego, and we could have these phone calls, but we'd have to pay long distance rates. So we kept the phone calls short, and we could have very amiable phone calls. And then we could hang up the phone and he could shout back, "Goddamn Gordon," and I could shout that over. And then we could go back next time we could have a very amiable. So it's the only book I know of that kind of interleaves the chapters this way, and even comes to different conclusions. But I think its success is being able to see the linkage between this, what seems like spontaneous, but obviously very heavily culturally structured and subject to fashion, spirit possession, and this long tradition of texts that go back into the Ming that I had not really ever appreciated. So that's the cornerstone of the stuff that I dealt with. That I dealt with lots of other things, but this was what I think probably has the longest shadow, maybe, in appearing, disappearing, transforming, and because the behavior is so extravagant, it's in public, it's on streets, even in cities. You can't avoid seeing spirit mediums in trance, at least in the South. When I worked later in the North, I saw very little of this. I was in Taipei. It's very hard to do field work in the middle of a city like Taipei. It's just so difficult. Everybody's so private. In a little village, everything is so public. In a big place like Taipei, and especially if it's all just great big tall buildings and so forth, even their ancestral altars are on the roof. It's just they're inaccessible. But in the South, one sees it evolving before one's very eyes. Have I run past my time? I think I probably have.
I wanted to make 3 quick points. The first one builds directly on what David just said. I think in some early iteration of this, we were supposed to talk about what's changed in religion in our case. So everything has changed in some ways, right? I want to reiterate, that's also my experience. I think my expectation going to the field, so this is my dissertation topic, so 1977 is when I started, from reading what my elders had written, but I think also from the kind of secularization theory that was still pretty much in the air in the 1970s. I thought I was doing some kind of salvage ethnography. I was studying something that wasn't going to be around in another 15 or 20 years. And in retrospect, so the problem with what we do as anthropologists is we have a year and a half. It's like nothing if you're trying to look at processes of change. It's nothing. So in retrospect, looking back at that moment, if you elders had been right at all, my guess is you were right. It did appear to be dying out earlier. This was the transition moment. That when I was there, because it didn't feel dying out when I was there, and now in retrospect, we can look back and say, it's changed. It's totally changed. But dying out is not the word for what happened. So partly, 1970s economic success. People have money in their pockets for the first time that they can remember. And a lot of it's going into local temple construction. Pilgrimages start to take on this giant scale that they have now. Those new Buddhisms, which if you think of them as philanthropic movements, these are responses to a certain kind of capitalism and the lacks of a certain kind of capitalism, especially in a anti-welfare state like the KMT was. So all of that is happening right at that moment when I was there, but it just, given how we do research, it's very hard to put this into a historical context. And then, looking back from even a little bit later, democratization changed everything. When politicians, those very politicians who were mocking this stuff as Stone Age religion or whatever, are showing up in temples because temples control networks of people and therefore votes. And then all of this blooming of new kinds of creative spaces that are so easy, and probably Dinger and Jia that you mentioned is the most important documenter of the weird craziness that's happened. But since David's already talked about this, I don't want to spend any more time on it, except just to say that change is really constant. All right, the other 2 changes they're about me, or they're about anthropology or something like that. The first one, that is the second of my 3 changes, is that when I went in 1977 to look at religion, I knew what religion was. When I left in 1979, I didn't know what religion was anymore. And now, all these years later, I'm even less sure of what it was. So I'm going to do an anecdote because I'm sitting next to David. But the one thing that really marked this for me was must have been 1978 at some point, and I'm talking to some older woman who I knew burnt incense every single day for deities and ancestors. I knew she did this. And for reasons I can't reconstruct, I asked her what now seems like a stupid question: what religion do you follow? And she was confused. She was baffled. And I thought, oh, my Taiwanese, it's even crappier than I thought it was. But her adult son was there. His Mandarin was completely fluent. My Mandarin's much more comfortable than my Taiwanese ever was. So I tell him, he translates into Taiwanese, nothing. She has no idea what he's talking about. So there's this kind of awkwardness goes on for a while. And then a light bulb goes off in her head. You can like see it. And she says, oh, Donggao, I know what that is. I've seen that on TV, she says. I've seen it on TV. I know what you mean. She said, no, I don't have that. I just burn incense. I just have, what do you call that thing, she says? Daoist. That was it. So for me, that was a moment. It wasn't like she said, oh, I refuse your category of Buddhist or Taoist. I do some syncretic thing, or I'm a Buddhist, what most people really would say. You know, I'd seen all those like Taiwan social survey when they have religion questions, and it was like, are you a Buddhist or a Taoist or a Christian or what? And people answer that question. And that's probably what got me to ask the question of this woman. But it's a terrible question. It's a completely anachronistic question. Because it wasn't that I didn't understand what she was doing. It was that it wasn't a concept. This whole way of viewing the world wasn't a concept. And, you know, now looking back at it, the fact that that meant something to me at the time, I think was part of what's going on in anthropology in the 1980s when I'm actually digesting this, I think, which is the beginnings of a critique of all these Enlightenment categories that are the fundamentals of modern social science. And religion is just one of those kinds of categories. And then, of course, in our field, we have things like we'll go Sarah and Palmer, right, who really take apart the history of that particular word in China, or Rebecca Nadasta, the historian, who kind of does the same work for us. But it's part of a much broader thing where religion is really established in opposition to two opposites that also have to be made up at the same time. Opposite on the one hand to the secular, opposite on the other hand to the superstitious. So that, you know, for me, that was a really important realization, along with a more recent realization that all those KMT policies that were quite grumpy about religion, I would say, not repressive by Cultural Revolution standards or something, but grumpy. But also the PRC policies, which are very much inherited from ROC, like mainland period ROC policies, but more severe. Those come from exactly the same place that our anthropological conceptions of religion come from. Exactly the same place. And that in a sense, we're implicated in the very thing that all of us who work on religion, whatever it is, in China or in Taiwan, criticize the state for doing, and yet it really affects our field too. It is the same religion. So I had an argument with Daniel Overmeyer one point where I said, this word is, oh bless you. I said, this word is horrible, right? It's anachronistic, it's inappropriate, it's misleading us, we shouldn't use it. And Daniel said, absolutely no way should you stop using it, because then we can't have a conversation with anybody outside of our little field, which I thought was a reasonable a reasonable position to take. So I didn't give up using it completely, but I use it with enormous caution now in a way that I didn't before. So the last one is maybe about culture rather than religion, but it actually starts from an unusual maybe place. I don't know if any of you saw I think it's the most recent issue of How has a best schrifty kind of thing for Catherine Verdery, who was also one of my teachers when I was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins. And Emily wrote a piece, because Emily and Catherine were colleagues during that Hopkins period. Emily wrote a piece, and I know that at some point she was planning to come to this. So I think she was thinking about this, just because let me tell you what's in the piece with the assumption that you haven't actually read it. She starts off talking about how she went to Taiwan in whatever it was, thinking of Taiwan as a token for China. Taiwan was going to be an example of Chinese culture. And I do have this vague memory of Emily. I took a course from Emily when I was maybe a junior in college. and she was maybe a first-year assistant professor or second-year assistant professor, super early. I do have this vague memory that she did say something like that. I imagine she got it from Arthur and that she was teaching some Arthur or yeah, probably some Arthur version of that course. It's what you do when you're a new assistant professor. But I was still a little surprised to see it there because honestly, that is never how I thought about the situation. And I think the reason I never thought about it that way is because I went to graduate school when I went to graduate school, roughly a decade after when Emily went to graduate school. So Emily goes on to say how it was Catherine who pointed out to her that that was not a useful way to think about Taiwan. And it's a kind of world systems-y argument, right? That every place is a unique spot in the world system and has to be taken on its own account. But also, so she's giving all the credit to Catherine for this because it was a special thing for Catherine, okay. But the fact is the Johns Hopkins Anthropology Department was founded as a collaboration between anthropology and history, particularly over the Atlantic slave trade. And all of us were brought up on the basic idea that every time is unique, every place is unique, and it has to be understood in its historical and changing, constantly changing context. So my teachers were Catherine, were Sid Mintz, not Eric Wolf, but he would, because of the relation to Mintz, he was kind of a godfather to the department, I would say. So that, you know, it's that stuff that Hill was mentioning earlier. That's what I was brought up on. And so that when Emily says, I thought of Taiwan just as a token of China, it rang so false to me because it was so how I was not educated, including not by Emily, at least at the point when I was in graduate school with her. And then this train of thought led me back to, I know that David and Steve will remember this because they were dragged in or you dragged yourself in. David had written a review of my first book, the one that was based sort of on the dissertation. And it was a pretty nice review. I didn't look back at it, but I remember it being.
I don't even remember it. So.
Oh, it was.
You can tell me I said pretty much anything. Did I say good things?
He said it was the best book ever written.
I'm sure it was.
And I've always been great. No, what he said was, yeah, it's an okay book. And he had, you know, like a lot of book reviews, said, oh, it's a good book, you should read it. But I have a couple quibbles. Quibble one was, you romanized everything in Mandarin, it's so annoying. You romanized everything in Taiwanese, and hello, it's so annoying. It should have been Mandarin. And the other one was, if you're going to have this really political reading of religion, why didn't you talk to the political people, right, to the KMT or to the local government? And you heard what he just said about talking to the KMT and the Ministry of whatever it was. So, you know, he's actually done that. So the language one, I actually didn't agree with then, and I don't agree with now. The talk to the state one, I did agree with, and I still agree with it. And I've reformed myself, David.
Oh, okay.
But that's not why I told this story. Murray and Hall wrote a letter to the editor. How can you not remember this? You were brutally attacked.
Yeah, but I'm a very senile, so it's okay.
Okay.
Just washes off.
I believe this was their first foray into what ended up as that book that we saw this morning. And they attacked David as a tool of the KMT because Mandarin, the language of the colonizers, because why would you talk to those political people when you know they're just going to lie to you anyway? But it was way over the top. And a kind of personal attack on David and an implied attack on most of our field. Norma Diamond was sort of spared, and I was sort of spared. No, you were not. And when I read it, so I didn't even know about this for several months. I had let my membership lapse because I had no money, and AAA is kind of a useless organization anyway. And they actually, I think Murray had actually written me a letter saying, as you know, we are fans of your book. Like, I had no idea, I never heard of him. I hadn't read it, hadn't even read the review. So I went back and I looked and it was like, what is this? What does this have to do with me? And it's because it wasn't an argument of the sort I learned as a graduate student. It was an argument of the, is it Chinese culture or is it Taiwanese culture? And from my point of view, even then, and so we're in the late 80s by the time all of this is being published, 88, 89 maybe. Even then, that wasn't the thing, that use of culture was just wrong and misleading. And all it can lead to is ethnic conflict. There's no other direction to go, and it's bad anthropology. So I said I ended up keeping the word religion. I would not use the word culture for at least a decade after I finished my PhD for these kinds of reasons. But where I really want to go with this is to say that, if we read this through the lens of that Marianne Hong book, we end up saying, this is about which side you're on, in the identity wars of Taiwan. Which side are you on? And for me, it was never about that. And I think, for most of us, our politics aren't that different from each other. In the context of 1970s Taiwan, we were all far to the left of what the state wanted us to be. I don't know about you, David, but I'm assuming you too. We all had a lot of empathy for the people we were living with and working with and learning from. But I don't think that's the difference between us. The difference between us was not whether we liked the KMT state or we thought there should be Taiwan independence. I don't think that was anything to do with it. It was an understanding of culture and how culture could relate, and whether it even made sense to say something like Taiwan is just an example of Chinese culture, as if that was a thing. And for me, it couldn't be a thing. And so it's not about our politics, not even about Taiwan politics. It's really about an evolution in anthropology that I think happened, right? This is really 1980s anthropology is pushing us in this direction that later ends up labeled as postmodern or something. But I think the problems with the concept of culture, the reaction against Levi-Strauss, who was like the sinking star at the time when I was in graduate school, or Geertz, who was very much the big star in the sky when I was there, right? It was so we're the next generation. It's Oedipus, we want to kill them, right? Many of us are trying to think about alternatives to that way of understanding what anthropology is for. And so for me, that's what I thought I was doing. And I want to leave it there and let the room go crazy again.
Open up the floor if I may be cheeky and get the first one in. So one of the questions I kind of wanted to ask, and actually I'd say it would be for the pair of you, but it really builds on what you were saying a moment ago there, Rob. It's about how the changes in the disciplines. So whether or not, obviously, the pair of you from anthropology, but we also, as we know, historians were also working on Taiwan at the same time, and about how these kinds of shifts actually in how our disciplines were have kind of translated into the types of questions that you both were asking at the times that you were there. And perhaps present day anthropologists are now asking what questions in Taiwan is more related to the changes in the disciplines as opposed to specific changes in Taiwanese society. So your thoughts on the question? Why you
don't want to answer that. So I talked about some aspects of that, but certainly the field has continued to evolve very much. My second book, The Resistance, Chaos, and Control one, is real. I've seen in retrospect how reactionary I am, but the 80s was when anthropology discovered resistance and agency, right? So that's why my second book is like, no, screw this concept of resistance. This is simple-minded. You can't reduce things like that. The field continues to evolve, or go in circles, or whatever it is that we're doing. It continues to change. Identity, somebody threw Judith Butler's name out there, but that's again when is Gender Trouble? 1987 or something like that, right? It's right around this time also. And because Taiwan is such a good place to be looking at not just ethnic identity, but gender identity right now, right? I think we're getting a lot of that kind of thing in Taiwan. So it definitely moves with the field, or maybe a step or two behind the field. I'm not sure.
I'm not much of a theory kind of person. I always feel edgy about the word religion because I'm not sure religious belief is different from other belief. Belief is belief is belief, and if you believe something, that's a very interesting fact, but the nature of the belief is separate from the idea of belief, which gets us into the world of semi-belief, half-belief, circumstantial belief, and so forth and so on. Years and years ago, it occurred to me that a really careful analysis of any analytical structure will eventually convince you that it doesn't exist. So I'm a little bit suspicious of my very suspicion that the belief doesn't, that religion doesn't exist. But I'm also suspicious of that maybe suspicion doesn't exist. So I think part of the dynamic of the thing evolving, of our conceptions of things evolving over time, is just this. You talk about this sort of Oedipal thing, you got to kill off the previous generation. That's fine. Yeah, we do that a lot. Archaeologists do it a whole lot. But it's also just the fact that these concepts are so squishy. It's so easy to find something that's a little bit interesting because people haven't done it. Or it's a different take on something. So you figure, oh, that's pretty cool. And then you kind of look into it and you get something that said, and then it ceases to exist a little bit later. So I don't know. I maybe fashion exists. Fashion is pretty substantial out there.
Can I answer in a totally different way from
Sure.
what I just said?
Oh, this evolution goes very rapidly. Sir Weller, you're way ahead of everybody here.
So I realize that the way I write all those books is, here's this theoretical problem, let's figure out how to deal with it. But that's a lie. You should know that's a lie. Everything I've done, except maybe the dissertation, which was driven by that Arthur Wolf, Morris Friedman debate that probably you all know. Everything I've done is because something just empirically puzzles me. And it's because Taiwan and China, for me, I do both, but it's because it continues to be so interesting. There's always a new puzzle, so that Religion and Philanthropy book was because, like, why is there all this religious philanthropy? When I was there in the 70s, I don't remember any religious philanthropy. And what happened? It's just the empirical puzzle. Even it's part of that resistance book, but that Shiba Wan Gong Miao. It was just like friends who said, oh, there's this weird temple, you like temples, check this out, a decade after my original work. And it was fascinating. That's it. My current work on mainland China is the same. Like, what happens to village religion when you wipe out both the temples and the villages themselves, right? Before you just rebuilt the temple, but now you can't. So they're really empirical questions. And that book's not written, but whenever it is, it's going to look like some great theoretical thing, but just know it's not true.
Maybe it'll have all blank pages because they wiped out the villages of the town.
I'll tell you later, but I have a book with a blank chapter. Nobody wants to publish it.
I just wanted to say one thing about law. At a meeting, the details of which I no longer remember, but we were all sitting around talking about religion, and it was about the unity of unified thinking in China and how it was such a big goal and blah, blah, blah. And you said patiently, you guys are also Protestant. There had to be some kind of inner spiritual thing. I mean, that's what a Protestant is. Somebody who is rejected back in the Middle Ages or late Middle Ages, rejected all the Doodah, which is the real part of the religion in a Durkheimian way. The inner stuff is pure, let's get out from under Rome and have our own monasteries that have our own money. It was very useful intervention.
Thank you. I wish I remember.
And the point about David is that I think I'm going to talk a bit more about this tomorrow, but I think where you personally come from, when you see religion as an enduring thing that may have roots in the past, but if you come from a personal situation where you have seen something very different from that, then you know they're making it up as they go along. And in fact, I could see that from the Tuli Gong Miao that is so central to my thinking in Ulosafulu, Udon, Taipei. It was so clear they were making it up as they went along. And it was lovely. I mean, they weren't controlled by anybody. They got to think their own thoughts. I like that about ordinary life among the Chinese.
Or anybody.
Or anybody, but we're always thinking about how controlled everybody is, especially in mainland China. They're all thinking about thoughts.
I think this, I probably wasn't that, I don't remember that comment about Protestant, but, you know, when I did my dissertation was on religion. Right? And it was on individual difference, which was heretical as hell in those days, because we were in the heyday of structuralism. And then maybe Levi-Strauss's star was starting to sink a little bit, but, you know, we've been through British structuralism and French structuralism and all these different kinds of things. And they all assumed a culture. And when you went and did field work, you went and found the most knowledgeable people. And the most knowledgeable people were, as Gertz said in his famous Religion and Cultural System article, you know, the people who had a coherent view of the world. And so anthropologists started thinking of cultures as coherent views of the world. And of course, when you wanted to find out that, you found out the one who knew the most. And, you know, Victor Turner's Muchona the Hornet and all these kind of things. And so it was exactly the same process as you talk about, Rob. I mean, it was in 1970 when we were living in Sunshine, and I went to this house and there happened to be Daoist priests doing something. And, you know, I don't remember what the ritual was. And then afterwards, I was really interested by a priest had packed up his paraphernalia and left, and I still using an interpreter in those days. I didn't know Taiwanese yet. And I said, you know, what was this guy doing? You know, tell me, explain it to me. I don't know. You know, Saigon Mangia, right? This is the stuff of Taoist priests, and we don't know anything. And I say, do you think it's going to do any good? And they go, I don't know, probably not.
His job.
Yeah, right. And so, you know, the idea that there is a system that you can find out by talking to the most knowledgeable people. Well, they do. They are the ones who perhaps pass it on. But, you know, there's a whole lot of people are just sort of, well, I mean, the famous question of, when you go to the temple to ask God for a favor, does this do any good? I'm talking to one old lady, and she said, well, you know, once I had a bad knee, and there were pushcart pushers on the King Ben Cha, right? And so my knee really hurt, and I was, you know, couldn't push as many carts. And so told me that Manzu at Bakan Ma was affected. So I managed to get myself a train ticket. I went down there, and I, you know, burned my incense and did my thing. And I came back, and yeah, it got better. So of course, mine got better anyway. You know, so. And it was this kind of attitude that didn't get into the anthropology books of that particular era because they were so consumed with the idea of constructing these coherent cultural systems. And so that's why I decided to do the dissertation. It was the same sort of thing. I went to study lineages. I'll talk about that tomorrow, right? But then I found some lineages and then blah blah blah. And, you know, I made all kinds of diagrams, and then when I saw this, oh my God, there's people who are suspicious of their own religion. Oh well, that's what I'm going to do for my dissertation, you know. And then I went through an iteration. I won't iterate them all now here. That won't take too much time. But that's how I ended up studying ethnicity in in southwest Sichuan, and that's how I ended up doing environmental anthropology, because those people live close to the earth. So it's I was never motivated by a theoretical question. I was always motivated by something I saw, and I remember, I think it was a review of one of Rob's books, but I would turn out to be the peer reviewer for publication for what, 4 of your books? And you for 2 of mine at least. We had this sort of, under the table, scratch my back thing. But
We'll just
I
be
said,
recorded.
his approach is, it comes from Goethe's Faust, right? Am Anfang war die Tat, right? In the beginning was the deed. And that's very different from, the Protestant tradition. In the beginning was the word, which, Goethe starts out with and then rejects. And I think that's just an example of how anthropology, not at the level of are we imperialist or not imperialist, that we, and were we in cahoots with the Guomindang and oppressing the Taiwanese and this kind of question, but at a much more general epistemological level, it really switches. And I have no idea where it goes anymore. It may just, be going in a sort of endless spiral.
Turtles all the way down.
What?
Turtles all the way down.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, this is sort of riffing on what I'm saying, but it's I think it explains about the same amount of the progression of study of anthropology in Taiwan as it's explained by the social and political changes that have happened in Taiwan society. I don't know, 50-50 or 60-40, but something of that sort.
Yeah, I sort of have an observation and I have a question for actually for all the so my observation is that, because I'm a historian, I am trying to look at changes. So, and also when we use these words and terms like religion and culture, we don't really seem to have this kind of, I don't know how to describe it, the kind of baggage in terms of, because for me, we can sort of use those to basically describe the kind of phenomena we want to look at, but with an understanding that, there's no such thing as essentialist culture of any kind or essentialist kind of religion. So we're more empirical to begin with, right? So that's, this is why it's so the problem that you guys are talking about is really not a problem with history. So that's the observation. And again, I don't know if that really helps you, but this is, and again, I'm not saying history is perfect. We have our own problems. Sometimes we get too empirical. And, when I end up at Institute of Sociology, Academia Sinica, when I go over to Institute of Modern History, say, John, you don't want to associate yourself too much with the sociologists. They start becoming a historian. They poisonous. They always about theory, grand theory. Okay, so then here's my question, right? Because in terms of again, doing this project is really interesting for me. I cannot say that I've read all of your work. I mean, some of the works are pretty important. So for the China study, so I've basically done some of that. But then I have this feeling that because a lot of the anthropological studies I read nowadays, because there's so much about like identity politics and positionality and not trying to be an imperialist. And some of I'm not saying all of them, right? But some of them I'm on committee on. I have to read the entire thing. I was kind of like, after reading this entire anthropological study of maybe a community in the Middle East, I learned more about the author than the actual community. I don't know what to call it. You want to call it, like structure. That is you want to talk about all these kind of complications. That's fine. But you know what? The bottom line is, I do really want to understand those Arabs. And I basically end up with more understanding you or what you think about the Arabs and your guilt about yourself than about the Arabs, but I want to know about the Arabs. So I want to know what you guys think on this. I mean, I don't want to say this is a criticism to cultural anthropology or whatnot. I just want to, to think about what you think on the point I just talked about. Okay, I know it's a big question.
You're already becoming an anthropologist as we speak.
I have a question, kind of question, because it has to do with my very unconventional, mainstream anthropology training. I don't know anything about the literature of religion, but I've worked with a great anthropologist who does study religion, Pascal Boyer. And recently I interviewed him. That's the first time I even thought of like asking him how, like, his view of religion has ever changed. He told me that it did change. So in the past, he just used this umbrella concept of religion, but now he's working on what's called wild religion. He said he really believes that the institutionalized religion in Europe and other places are fundamentally different from the sort of things he first saw in Cameroon and West Africa, the witchcraft, divination, that sort of thing. And he thinks that wild religion is very much part of human nature, and it will, secularization or not, it will always remain with us in every part of this planet Earth. And then after talking to him, I realized I grew up in folk religion, like going to temple. I don't know how Hagro in Hagro is called Hua, that you have those half moon shaped stuff, and then you yin yang and all that. And I was like, when I grew up, is it folk religion? It is wild religion, right? For that concept of religion is a very alien concept to my sort of experience growing up as a child in Central South China, where I go with my mom to those temples, and they care about very ordinary things. It's not asking about eternity of your soul and questions like that. And Pascal gave an example saying that, in the tribe world, somebody drunk fall from a tree, you have to have an explanation. Why is this person at this time born and this, in this moment? You cannot use a Newton's physics law to explain why maybe your toe slipped and you fall, or you cannot use a too wide of a too abstract scope sort of thing to explain that either. It has to be right about it. So witchcraft and other sort of things really explained it well. I'm like, oh, it makes sense to me. So I was just my anecdotal observation, and I want to know how you think about that. The larger sort of tension between religion, the concept, because anthropologists started from the European and all that Africanist tradition, and the thing that people who study have had in psychology, there's always this tension. How do you explain the I don't know, is it different sort of phenomena, or it doesn't matter? We can just, as long as we know what we're talking about, and our interlocutors, reviewers know what we're talking about by using certain concepts, right?
If you put up the world map, please put up the world map. Leave North and South America out of it, because that was a different world. It really was. You get the Bronze Iron Age Mediterranean states, which go along for a long time. They came into existence 3,000-5,000 years ago, whenever it was. And you get India and China and various neighboring small states. And then on the fringes at the north is Europe. And they are the tribal ancestors of us who came from there. And below that is Africa, where you have the tribal ancestors of the Black diaspora and Africa itself. And you really can't get very far without starting to think, well, it is the states that develop these really strong religions where you're supposed to do stuff. And the fringes, like our European wild ancestors and the African wild ancestors, who get to make it up as they go along. Now, there's more to the world than that, and you can see a lot of that from your book about family systems. It was a wonderfully wide open picture of the world in terms of families, and it's really one of the great books he's written, and I'm not sure how many of you have read it, but it's well worth
It's way
reading.
too long to read.
Hmm?
It's way too long to read.
So anyway, they're kind of was an old white guy, a long ago old white guy. He has things to teach us that are not fragile, that they stick. Pay attention to that.